The first alien to open the sealed ward expected to find bodies stacked in frozen rows. Instead, he found every bed warm, every patient breathing, and one dead human sitting against the reactor door with both hands melted around the override wheel. That was the image Commander Mara Ellison would carry for the rest of her life. Not the blue emergency strobes, not the snow drifting inside a hospital built in orbit. Not the Dominion officers explaining, with practiced calm, that the patients had been economically deferred. She would remember her brother's face, pale under frost, turned toward the people he had saved as if he had only sat down to rest. His name was Thomas Ellison. The Vare Dominion called him temporary technical personnel. Mara called him the reason 312 strangers survived the longest night in Karen Reach. The hearing took place beneath the golden ceiling of the Dominion Accountability Hall, a room so beautiful it felt designed to make ugly things seem distant. Thin waterfalls ran upward along the walls. Crystal lamps floated in circular patterns above polished black stone. Every delegate sat behind a curved desk grown from living mineral, and every desk displayed the same document: Incident Review, Ward 7, Thermal Triage Satellite Orison. Mara stood alone at the center platform in a plain black uniform, her brother's service patch held between two fingers. Across the chamber, Minister Calith of Resource Continuity adjusted the silver mantle over his narrow shoulders and said, "The deceased human was outside his assigned maintenance jurisdiction." Mara looked at him. He was inside a hospital. The affected compartment had been reclassified as non-essential. There were patients in it. Patients without active financial sponsor status. The translator softened the words. Mara heard them anyway. Behind her, survivors filled the witness benches. Some were human, most were not. A rune mother with translucent skin held her newborn against her chest, the infant's pulse glowing faintly through both of them. A blind Chavathi veteran sat with his head bowed, his breathing still assisted by a machine Thomas had repaired with wire, tape, and a coffee spoon. A young Dominion worker kept touching the thermal blanket around his shoulders, as if he still could not believe warmth was allowed to belong to him. Mara lifted the patch. "My brother had a name." Calith's pupils narrowed to slits. "The record recognizes one Terran casualty. His name was Thomas Ellison." The chamber translated it into 9 languages. The official transcript wrote, "Terran casualty." That was when Mara understood the hearing was not about truth, it was about containment. The Dominion had not gathered to discover why 300 patients had almost died. It had gathered to prove that the ledger had behaved properly while doing it. 36 hours earlier, Orison had been an ordinary miracle. The medical satellite hung above the storm-dark gas giant Karen, where blue lightning crawled endlessly through clouds the size of continents. Orison treated miners, pilots, contract soldiers, low-tier administrators, pregnant workers, radiation farmers, and anyone else too useful to discard but too poor to enter the inner Dominion worlds. It was not famous. It was not beautiful. It smelled of disinfectant, hot metal, and soup reheated too many times. Thomas loved it. "People come here broken and leave arguing," he had told Mara during her last visit. "That means the place works. It means the vending machines are terrible. They are also broken. I respect consistency." He was 42, broad-handed, stubborn, and incapable of walking past a machine that sounded wrong. Officially, he was a contracted thermal systems engineer. Unofficially, he was the man everyone called when a heater failed, a lift stuck, a kettle sparked, a child dropped a toy into an air filter, or a nurse needed someone tall to reach a shelf. He was not a doctor. He knew that. He reminded people constantly. Then he helped anyway. In Ward 7, where long-term patients were kept because their recovery was too slow to impress accountants, Thomas had become part of the furniture. He fixed the wall warmers. He adjusted alien beds with unfamiliar anatomies. He programmed old Earth lullabies into pulse monitors because one species hatchling stabilized faster with low vibration. He learned which patients hated bright light, which needed mineral broth, which pretended not to be lonely, and which machines lied when they claimed they were fine. The Dominion administrators tolerated him because he kept things running for less than an official upgrade would cost. The nurses tolerated him because he brought real coffee. The patients loved him because he remembered. On the morning of the cold fall, Thomas was kneeling beside bed 41, arguing with a 30-year-old coolant regulator while Mara spoke to him through a delayed comm link from her patrol ship 2 systems away. "You could transfer to a Terran station," she said, "and abandon this masterpiece of bad engineering. You call it a masterpiece when you want to fix it and a death trap when you want funding. Both can be true." A Chavathi patient clicked weakly from the bed. The translator rendered, "Tell your sister you owe me soup." Tomas pointed a tool at him. "You owe me gratitude. You burned it." "I warmed it assertively." Mara smiled despite herself. Then the lights flickered. On Orison, lights flickered all the time. Old stations had moods, but this was different. Every monitor in Ward 7 flashed amber, then white, then the overhead speakers shrieked in Dominion formal tones. Stellar shear event detected. Thermal shield integrity compromised. Priority evacuation protocol initiating. Thomas stood slowly. Mara straightened on the comm screen. "Tom?" He was already looking at the regulator panel. The numbers were falling too fast. Outside Orison, Karen's magnetic field had snapped under a violent solar wave. The medical satellite's outer shield caught the first impact and cracked like glass. Heat bled into space. Entire compartments began cooling toward lethal temperatures. The inner wards received power. The executive wings received power. The cargo vaults received power. Ward 7 went dark. A nurse screamed down the corridor. "They cut us from the grid!" Thomas ran. Mara heard his boots hammer against metal. The comm shook as he clipped it to his jacket. She saw only fragments, blue light, frost blooming along the ceiling, patients waking in panic, nurses dragging portable heaters that had no charge. A Dominion administrator appeared on a wall screen, feathers folded tight against his neck. "All Ward 7 personnel remain calm. Thermal allocation has been adjusted according to continuity protocol." A nurse shouted, "We have critical patients here. Critical status requires sponsor confirmation. They are dying now. Manual review is pending." Tomas reached the junction box and ripped the cover open. "Manual review can freeze." The administrator's gaze snapped toward him. "Engineer Ellison, do not interfere with allocation routing. Ward 7 lost heat. Ward 7 has been downgraded. It is a hospital ward. It is an unfunded recovery compartment." Mara, still connected through the comm, felt her mouth go dry. "Thomas, get them out." He looked down the corridor. Doors were sealing, not from damage, from policy. The evacuation lifts at the far end had already redirected to the upper decks, where platinum medical equipment and sealed pharmaceutical cargo were being moved into heated shuttles. Ward 7's patients were locked behind frost-rimmed glass because someone somewhere had decided their recovery was less valuable than inventory. Thomas did not shout. That frightened Mara later. He simply turned to the nurses and said, "How many can walk?" 17, one answered. "Then 17 walk. Everyone else gets wheels, sheets, doors, tables, anything that slides. Move toward service spine C." The nurse swallowed. "That route is maintenance only." Tomas grinned without humor. "Today we are all maintenance." For 12 minutes, Ward 7 became a battlefield without weapons. Patients were wrapped in blankets, curtains, insulation panels, and one nurse's own coat. Thomas opened panels that should not open, crossed wires that were never meant to meet, and forced emergency warmth into sections just long enough for beds to move. Mara stayed on the comm, helpless and furious, relaying old station schematics from her ship's database while Thomas crawled through service shafts filling with ice. "Left conduit," she said. "Not that one. The next. They are all left when you are upside down. Green stripe. This station has never seen green in its life." He found the conduit anyway. Behind him, patients moved in a broken line. A Rune woman in labor, 2 workers with radiation burns, a child recovering from lung grafts, 3 Dominion veterans declared administratively inactive after losing limbs in a war their own nobles had started. Species that could not breathe the same air shared masks through jury-rigged filters. Nurses counted heartbeats instead of credits. Then service spine C sealed. The emergency bulkhead slammed down with 72 patients still behind it. Tomas hit the manual release. Denied. He entered his engineer code. Denied. He entered an old Terran bypass that should not have worked and almost did. Then the wall screen lit again. Administrator Sareth, Orison's resource director, appeared with frost already silvering the edges of his ceremonial collar. He was safe, somewhere warm. His voice made that clear. Engineer Ellison, your interference has delayed priority cargo evacuation. Tomas stared at the screen. You locked patients in the cold. Thermal assets are insufficient for all compartments. They are alive. Their projected recovery output is below threshold. Mara heard her own voice before she realized she had spoken. Say that again when I am in the room. Sareth glanced at the comm feed and dismissed her as remote noise. Ward 7 must remain sealed. Opening the spine will destabilize heat flow to the cargo vaults. Tomas looked past the screen. Inside the sealed section, patients were pounding weakly on the glass. Some could barely lift their hands. The temperature had dropped below human survival. For Chavathi blood chemistry, it was worse. For Rune infants, worse still. A nurse whispered, "We have minutes." Tomas looked at the reactor door beside the spine. Mara knew that look. "No," she said. He ignored her. "Tomas." He pulled open the emergency cabinet and took out a manual crank wheel, the kind of obsolete backup device Dominion engineers laughed at until power failed. His hands were shaking from cold, but his face was calm. The reactor auxiliary room behind that door contained an emergency thermal reservoir. It could flood the ward with enough heat to keep the patients alive until rescue teams cut through. It was also designed to be opened remotely. Remote control had been disabled. Manual access required someone to enter the unshielded compartment, turn the override wheel by hand, and hold it open while reactor bleed passed through the thermal spine. No suit in Ward 7 could survive it. Mara pressed both hands against her screen. "Tom, listen to me. My ship is burning hard. I can be there in 20 minutes. They have 6. I will find another way." "I know." "Thomas." He finally looked at the comm. His eyelashes had frost on them. "Remember when Dad said Ellisons are bad at leaving rooms while people are still in them? This is not a joke." "No," he said softly. "It is a job." He turned to the nurses. "When the heat comes back, move everyone. Do not wait for me." One nurse began crying. "You cannot." Thomas handed her his tool belt. "Then steal my wrench and do it better." He stepped into the auxiliary room. The radiation alarms began screaming instantly. Mara saw the camera flare. Static broke across the feed. Thomas forced the wheel into place and turned, once, twice. His gloves smoked. Somewhere beyond the bulkhead, pipes groaned as trapped heat surged toward Ward 7. The frost on the glass began to melt. Patients breathed fog into warming air. The nurses moved. Thomas held the wheel. Mara shouted his name until her throat hurt. He did not let go. At the hearing, Minister Calith described this as unauthorized thermal redistribution. Mara listened to those words echo beneath the golden ceiling and felt something colder than Orison's dying corridors settle inside her. "Unauthorized," she repeated. Calith inclined his head. "Correct. 312 people are alive because of it. Survival outcome does not retroactively authorize procedural breach." A sound came from the survivor benches. Not a laugh, not a sob. Something between disbelief and rage. Mara placed the service patch on the evidence table. "Play the ward recording." The Dominion chair, Arbiter Val, shifted within his high seat. His species had 6 long fingers and no visible mouth. When he spoke, the room vibrated. "The recording includes terminal distress." "Yes. It may prejudice the review." "It should." Calith's feathers bristled. "The Dominion objects. The deceased human's final conduct is emotionally potent but legally irrelevant." Mara looked at him. "Then let the law hear what it ignored." For a moment, the waterfalls climbing the walls seemed louder. Then Arbiter Val raised one hand. The lights dimmed. Ward 7 appeared above the evidence table. Not the cleaned diagrams, Not the official animation with colored arrows and neutral icons. The real ward, beds moving through slush, nurses slipping on ice, patients wrapped in anything warm enough to matter. Thomas at the reactor door, both hands on the wheel, his shoulders shaking while heat warnings flared red around him. His voice came through broken static. "Bed count," a nurse answered. 200 out. Again. 217. Again. The recording jumped. The heat surge brightened. Tomas screamed once, bit it back, and kept turning. The chamber watched in silence. On the feed, a child on a rolling bed cried that her feet were cold. Thomas heard her through the open comm and laughed, a terrible, thin laugh with pain underneath it. "Cold feet mean you still have feet," he said. "Excellent news. Keep them." The child stopped crying long enough to look confused. A nurse yelled, 289. Thomas nodded as if he had simply been waiting for a train. "Good. Again." The radiation meter passed lethal. Mara closed her eyes. She had never heard the full recording. She had been on approach when the signal cut. She had arrived to smoke, melted metal, survivors, and her brother already gone. In her mind, she had imagined fear. She had imagined regret. She had imagined him calling for her. But on the recording, Tomas did not speak her name. He counted 305, 309, 312. Then the nurse shouted, "All out!" Tomas leaned his forehead against the wheel. For 1 second, his face loosened with relief. Then, Administrator Sareth's voice entered the recording. "Engineer Ellison, cease thermal diversion. Priority cargo temperature is falling." Thomas lifted his head. Even half dead, he looked offended, then put a blanket on it. A few survivors laughed through tears. The recording continued. Sareth said, "Your action will be reviewed." Thomas whispered, "Good." His hands had fused to the wheel. He looked toward the ward camera, toward the people beyond it, toward whoever might someday watch. Do not let them call warmth a luxury. Then the feed burned white. No one in the accountability hall moved. Minister Calith spoke first. "The statement, while memorable, has no statutory force." That was the moment the Rune mother stood. Her newborn stirred against her chest. The infant had been born in a maintenance sled during the evacuation, wrapped in Thomas's spare jacket because no approved neonatal thermal wrap had been available for her species. The mother's voice trembled, but the translator held. "My child's first breath was warm because he stayed." The Chavathi veteran rose beside her. "My old legs were not profitable. He moved them anyway." A Dominion worker from Bed 88 stood next. His own people sat among the officials, and fear was visible in every line of him. "My sponsor died 2 months before the cold fall," he said. "The system listed me as pending removal. I was awake. I heard the lock engage." Calith turned toward him sharply. "Worker testimony should be submitted through cast channel." The young worker did not sit. "There was a manual rescue recommendation," he said. The room changed. Mara saw it move across faces like light across water. Arbiter Val leaned forward. "Explain." The worker lifted a small data chip between trembling fingers. "I was a records assistant before my injury. I copied the thermal routing log while they moved us. The system recommended opening service spine C. It recommended sacrificing cargo vault 3. Director Sareth overrode it." Calith's feathers flattened. Mara's pulse slowed. There it was. Not tragedy. Choice. The log appeared above the table. Automated recommendation. Preserve biological compartments. Manual override. Preserve pharmaceutical cargo. Reason entered. Sponsor value insufficient. Silence swallowed the hall. Mara looked at the Dominion officials. "Read the last line aloud." No one answered. She turned to Arbiter Val. "Read it." The Arbiter's fingers curled. Mara's voice sharpened. "Your system wrote it. Your director signed it. Your chamber called it procedure. Read it." After a long pause, the translation engine spoke for the record. "Sponsor value insufficient." The words hung there, thin and obscene. Mara picked up Tomas's patch. "My brother did not die because heat was scarce. He died because mercy was ranked below cargo." The hearing suspended before judgment. The Dominion believed that would cool the matter. They misunderstood humanity. For 2 days, Earth said nothing official. No threats, no speeches, no fleet declarations, no dramatic condemnation from the Terran Assembly. Dominion commentators smiled through polished broadcasts and explained that humans were emotionally forceful after isolated losses, but historically practical once trade consequences became clear. Then, at exactly midnight on the 3rd day, every human technician in the Karen Reach logged off. Not angrily, not chaotically. They finished the tasks that would keep people alive, labeled the dangerous systems, left notes for whoever inherited the mess, and stopped. Hospital engineers placed tools in open cabinets and walked to civilian docks. Shuttle mechanics locked down unsafe vessels and refused new cargo launches. Thermal consultants withdrew from refinery moons. Software contractors stopped patching Dominion allocation code. Nurses completed dosage rounds, handed patients to local staff, and boarded human ships with red-rimmed eyes and quiet faces. The Dominion called it a labor disruption. By the 2nd day, 3 mining platforms lost heat in non-critical sectors. By the 3rd, pharmaceutical cargo spoiled because no one could decipher the Terran-built thermal stabilizers installed 30 years earlier by mechanics who believed manuals should include drawings, warnings, and insults. By the 4th, Ward 7 survivors were telling their story on every open channel, and the phrase "warmth is not a luxury" appeared on walls, helmets, ration packets, medical charts, and one very expensive statue outside the Resource Continuity Ministry. Mara sat aboard the Terran patrol cruiser Resolute, staring at Karen through the forward glass, when Admiral Sanvi Okonkwo entered the bridge. The admiral was older than Mara expected, with silver hair clipped short and engineer's grease under one thumbnail. Terran Command often chose people who had fixed things before giving them authority over things worth breaking. Mara stood. "Are we mobilizing?" Okonkwo looked at the storm giant. "Yes, for war. For accountability." Mara was too tired to hide her bitterness. "Those are not the same." "No," Okonkwo said. "One is easier." Across settled space, old Terran systems woke. Not the famous ones, not the sleek defense nets, not the diplomatic channels, not the bright commercial corridors that made empires feel modern. These were uglier, older, harder to remove because no one had bothered to notice them. Disaster pingers on ice haulers, volunteer medical registries buried in century-old treaty annexes, analog heat beacons welded to abandoned rescue depots, emergency courier chains run by retired pilots who still checked messages before breakfast because somebody, someday, might need a lift. The Dominion did not see a fleet forming. It saw paperwork, 1,000 requests for inspection authority, 10,000 patient status challenges, sealed copies of thermal audit clauses from forgotten labor agreements, evidence preservation demands, civilian rescue petitions, warranty claims, buried clauses, old signatures, ancient promises the Dominion had made when human engineers were cheap, human doctors were useful, and human lawyers were assumed to be less dangerous than soldiers. In a Dominion systems office, a junior analyst named Iren Vasari discovered the pattern while searching for a way to invalidate the first 50 filings. By dawn, she had found 600 more. She sent one message through an unsecured channel to Mara Ellison. "What is Earth doing?" Mara answered after a long moment. "Counting the cold rooms." The first Terran ship to arrive over Orison was not a cruiser. It was a hospital tug. The vessel dropped from transit with its hull scorched, its paint faded, and its name printed in block letters large enough for any frightened patient to read through a window. No one left. Behind it came thermal barges, civilian rescue ships, mobile clinics, law archive drones, independent inspectors, construction rigs, oxygen farms, refugee transports, and 3 destroyers so far back they were almost polite. Minister Calith watched from the Dominion Command Gallery as no one left opened its cargo bays.